Something on your computer. Mm-hmm. Yep, you're good. No, I always. Okay. Live. Good evening, everyone. So we begin the usual way. Our Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of Truth, however everywhere present and fills all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity, save our souls, a good one. Okay, so we've got a varied program today as last time. So we've got a little bit about, or maybe not that little, about St. John, the Abbot of Sinai and his ladder, and then three passages from the Gospel. But before we begin, I'd like to say that, well, people have the opportunity of typing in questions online, and I allow my operator to help me by reading those questions to me and filtering out some which he finds that possibly a little bit provocative or unnecessary. Sometimes we've had people asking really stupid things. People have just come on board and done that, and that's disruptive. So we don't want that. But after I read the question, I realized that it was from one of our regulars, and the question was about monsters in the world who initiate wars and that, he writes afterwards, after I contacted him, he says, it really shakes my faith that God does nothing to address these monsters in the world. Well, it's a big question, and one of the most difficult religious philosophical questions is the question of what's called theodicy. Theodicy is the question of the existence of evil and suffering in the world. And I've said before that it has to do with the tragic gift of free will that we have. And I also said that we cannot expect God to intervene every time that someone does something wrong. Otherwise, we wouldn't have any free will. I also said that God has stepped back from his omnipotence or almightiness to allow us to have that measure of free will. But if he intrudes into that space, well, the free will is gone. Now, that, of course, presupposes that people from the time of Adam have been making wrong choices and abusing their free will. And so we have the entry of evil and suffering into the world. And that, of course, is a very, very difficult thing, because, people who do not have faith in God, or at least who think they don't have faith in God, they say, well, where's your God? Look what's going on in the world, and there's so much suffering and bloodshed. And there is, as we speak, people have been killed, lots of them in Ukraine. Okay, that's awful, tragic, really bad. But there's also another aspect or plane of thinking and our contemplation, and that is that God looks at us and our life very differently from the way we look at it, because we are so much focused on the life of the body. Physical suffering and death are so horrific to us that we cannot imagine that there are worse things than physical suffering, and there are, from a spiritual point of view. The death of the soul is a much worse thing. The loss of a soul for eternity, which is possible. That's one of the choices a human being can make. A tragic choice. So the thing about evil and suffering is that these things contain a bitter medicine from severe spiritual problems. So, yes, evil and suffering as its result is awful, bad, but it is the cause, or rather the effect. It's the effect of a spiritual problem that initiated that. So those things, the evil and the suffering caused by evil, actually heal those things. Now, it's a big conversation, and it's very difficult to do justice to this big topic in just a couple of minutes. But I can give you a historical example in the 20th century. Now, two huge beasts, fascism, the Nazi ideology, and the communist ideology, rushed and attacked each other in the Second World War. As a result, one of them was killed. The beast of fascism or Nazi ideology was killed and condemned in Germany, and good on the Germans for doing that, for accepting that it was unviable. The other beast received a mortal wound, and so things changed in the Soviet Union after the war, or during the war, because the regime came close to destruction, and as a result, it had to take many steps back and allowed the opening of churches, this sort of thing, and was never able to recover the positions, the spiritual positions that it had before the war, when it managed to close down almost all of the 55,000 churches and monasteries that existed before the revolution. Only 400 of them stayed open in 1939, right? So it's a big topic, and I don't pretend that I can do justice to it in a couple of minutes, but I suspect that the person who asked the question will write to me or call me privately. That's okay. I'm willing to talk. And look, we will be covering aspects of this huge topic and this panorama of evil and suffering as we move further and further into the gospel narrative. Okay, now let's talk about today's saint. Now, every year on the fourth Sunday of Lent, the Church remembers one of the great teachers of spiritual life, teachers of prayer, what prayer and fasting is about. Because the reading today, the Sunday reading, was about prayer and fasting, but this is what gets rid of the demonic control of people. All right. So a little bit about St. John himself first. So he was the Abbot of Sinai, monastery that is now known as St. Catherine's. And actually, it's the oldest continually existing monastery in the world. It has not stopped monastic life for all of these many centuries. That's quite amazing. Now, the main source of the very few details of his biography come from his life, a short life written by Daniel of refutes, a place not far from Sinai. Now, unfortunately, this is more of a eulogy rather than a factual biography. So there aren't all that many facts of his biography. It seems that he came from a well-to-do family because he did receive a good secular education, which would not have been impossible for anyone coming from a poor background, because in those days, education cost a lot of money. Yes, at that time, we're talking about the 6th or first part of the 7th century. Sinai monastery had around 100 monastics, but which by today's standards is wow, it's a lot. But in those days it wasn't. Okay, there were actually several dozen small monasteries in that area around Sinai. He was elected abbot after 40 years of monastic life. It's a long time. So he was well into his middle age when he was elected. He was made abbot against his will. And in those days, that monastery wasn't called the St. Catherine's Monastery. It was known as the Monastery of the Burning Bush because, interestingly, and you can go and see them, it's the only place in the world where this particular plant can grow. They've tried replanting it even a few kilometers away, it won't grow. It just grows there. So this bush grows around the monastery, and it's there in the. I haven't been to the, unfortunately, although I've been to the Holy Land, but I didn't get to Sinai. God willing, maybe one day I will. But it grows behind the sanctuary, the bush. Yes, it's exactly the same bush which Moses saw, burning and being unconsumed. Interestingly, even in his lifetime, John became known as the new Moses. He had such a presence. According to church tradition, he died on the 30th of March, but we don't know exactly what year. And he, 10 months before he died, he handed over his place of the abbot to his brother, physical brother. His name was George, but his brother only outlived him by a short time. In literature about St. John, there are a number of educated guesses about the time of his life, but we can gain some insight from the text of the letter, because it's clear that he borrows certain aspects of the work of Saints Barsanuthius and John, question and answers, right? And they lived in the earlier part of the 6th century. Yes, those are their teachings are reflected in the letter. And he certainly lived quite a lot before Saint Theodore of Studian. Studian was an urban monastery in Constantinople. Saint Theodore, who founded the monastery, lived in the 8th century. Okay, but when he writes about John, he refers to him as, someone from the past. The letter was written at the request of another John, Abbot of the refutes monastery. Now, that monastery was situated on the shores of the Red Sea. Actually, there are two gulfs of the Red Sea in the northern part of it. The two gulfs form the peninsula of Sinai. So the eastern gulf is called Gulf of Aqaba, and the western gulf is called the Gulf of Suez. So the Refutes was on the Gulf of Suez, the western arm of the Red Sea. It teaches that everyone exercises their free will by either becoming a friend of Christ or his enemy. Although God wants salvation for us all, we are the ones who choose. So that's an important thought of John. And he also says that only the person who follows and emulates Christ can be called a Christian. He is very serious about commitment here. It's commitment to the death. Now, obviously, because this piece of writing was produced at the request of high-level monastic people, it's written at that level, and it's not so easy for us people living in the world to understand some parts of it, because we just don't have that experience. And a lot of it is written for monastics and the specifics of monastic life. But it doesn't mean we can't read that book. We can, because Christ did not give two sets of rules for monastics and people in the world. It's the same gospel, same principles. Okay, just a different lifestyle. Yes, John speaks. He writes rather a lot about the ideal of obedience. And early monasticism was very strong on that, the ideal of obedience, the relationship between the elder and the disciple. But he presents a rather strict and absolute picture, while some of his predecessors, even like Barsanuthius and John and Mark the ascetic, they delineate the difference between a commandment and an advice, two different things. or opinion of the elder. For instance, Saint Seraphim of Sarov says, he explains on one particular occasion, he says, sometimes a person asks me a question and I answer him, and I don't know why I said that. And that is the grace of God. But other times, I hear a question and I have to use my wits and my experience to answer that question. And then I could be wrong. So that's an opinion. So what St. John of the Ladder was talking about is that it was such an intense relationship that it was the disciple accepted every word of his elder as coming from God, and could not be disobeyed. There could not be any flexibility in them. Right. Well, all of this stuff, of course, for us is just academic interest. Look, even in the monastic world today, I do not know of any elders, and have never known of any elders at that level. They might exist, but if they do, they are not shown to the world. They could be living, even in the cities. We don't know. Hidden away. There's a beautiful story made into a film by a woman, a Russian medical scientist who lived actually past this. She lived longer, something like 102, to the age of 102, and she did research into tuberculosis in a medical institute, and there they had a bunch of women who were secret monastics, and they had little services, after hours in the institute during the times of the persecutions. Right? They had an elder. Mm-hmm. All right. So let's see what he says about passions and struggle with them, against them, rather. And John speaks of passions as natural impulses, which have become distorted. And of course, that's the way that the church tradition sees it. He says or writes that we turn the impulse for procreation into fornication. We have turned anger towards the serpent into anger towards our neighbor. Competition in virtues we've turned into competition in evil. We have an inner impulse for the glory of heaven, not for the glory of the earth, earthly glory, but we've turned it into a pursuit of earthly glory. It says also that pride was given to us to rise above the demons, not above humans. Makes an interesting observation that passions and demons are chaotic. They struggle not only against us, but against each other. And so, the struggler, the ascetic, can use passions, one passion against the other. for instance, to defeat them. For instance, he says, anger can defeat a more serious passion, the remembrance of wrongs, because remembrance of wrongs sits deep inside the soul, and if the person is not provoked, he will not come out with them. But anger brings it out, and then the other person might actually apologize and diffuse the problem, rather than that person stewing away in that fashion and that sinful thinking. I don't remember whether it's St. John or one of the other teachers writes that another example is a person may be greedy, but also vainglorious. And so, because vainglory are higher, is higher along the hierarchy, it's more powerful. And a greedy and stingy person can be made to part with some of their material goods, because they want to create a good impression, right? Sometimes there's a story in the life of one of the fools for Christ. He provoked a very greedy person, a merchant, who threw a piece of bread at him. And that was counted as a good deed from God, that he actually gave bread to him. It was one of the few things that he had before God. So the tools of the ascetic are salvific tears about our sins, contemplation of death, very powerful. As I've shared the story with you, even criminals, monsters, can be changed into lambs in contemplating and thinking about the day that they're going to die, that will be executed. This is people on the death row. Patience, limiting and controlling anger, and self-limitation in everything, this continence. St. John analyzes a whole list of passions. He dedicates whole chapters to the more dangerous ones in his book, such as anger, falsehood, gluttony, avarice, vainglory, pride, and others. In step 15, he describes the process of the origin of a passion. So, I didn't have time to check against the English text, the translation, but anyway, you'll get the gist. So the progression is like this. First of all, there's a suggestion, a thought. It's called logismos in Greek. Okay, it doesn't have to be verbal. It can be just an image. There's some sort of a suggestion. That's the beginning. Then there's a dialogue. Dialogue means, we enter into a conversation and we want to sort of either discern what it is or fight against it. Then there's agreement. That's when the person is either defeated in the struggle or it is tricked into agreeing. Then there's captivity. Okay. Then there's more struggle. And when that happens a lot, a passion develops, which is very difficult to heal, of course. As St. John lists the classic pattern of 8 passions. That's why I've been talking about the octopus in the last couple of weeks. 8 tentacles. But their order is different to the order of one of the earlier saints, Evagrius of Pontus. To Evagrius belongs, a very well-known quote when he says, "If you pray, you're a theologian. If you're a theologian, you will pray." Because that's the only way to know God. St. John is more like John Cassian, the Roman, a Western saint, who lists these passions or groups these passions according to aspects of the soul. Now, look, there are traditional aspects that, if I remember correctly, go back to Greek philosophy, to Aristotle. So there's, and they, because a lot of the early fathers, they studied secular philosophy, and they knew about this, and they used concepts that were useful. So he groups the first 3 as coming from what's called the irascible part of the soul. So that's in Greek, that's thymikon, okay, irascible, and that's irritable, okay, that's some sort of irritation. So he lists anger, sorrow, and despondency in that class. Now the next part is the part of the soul that has to do with desire. Okay, so the first part is about irritability. It was, reactive. The second part is kind of like proactive. It's a desire. So that's called epithematikon in Greek. So those Greek people that are watching, listening. And to that, he assigns the following passions: gluttony, fornication, and avarice, because they come from a desire. And the last group comes from what's called the reasonable part of the soul, logikon, okay? Sort of like logical. And these are vainglory and pride. Now, other Holy Fathers group them differently. They group them according to, look, there's obviously a connection here, but they group them according to body, soul, and spirit. So that way you have a slightly different progression. The same 8 passions, but they progress differently. So you've got gluttony, fornication, avarice, anger, sorrow, despondency, and vainglory and pride. Obviously, I can't comment about the whole book. I'm just giving you snippets, little bits of information, because we still have a couple of gospel passages to deal with. Explains lots of useful things, like he says, the relationship between vainglory and pride is the same as between a youth and an adult man. So vainglory is pride in its youth. Okay? Interestingly, he also connects fear to vainglory. Now, if you remember Peter at the mystical supper, he sort of bragged that even if everybody else abandons Jesus, he will not. He will stay there to the death. So, that's, and the Lord wanted to humble him because that was vainglorious. And see, there's the connection with fear. He exposed himself this way to fear. He writes that, when vainglory grows up and becomes an adult, the proud man doesn't need demons. He has become a demon himself and an enemy of himself. Pretty strong words. Now, St. John has influenced many successive ascetics and teachers. And the school and tradition of coming from Sinai accents the following things: sobriety, silence or stillness, and Jesus prayer. 3 things: sobriety, stillness, and Jesus prayer. All right, so now we get to the reading of Gospel. So, the third Passover, and Christ refutes pharisaical purity. Matthew chapter 15 from the beginning, first 20 verses. Right. Then the scribes and Pharisees who were from Jerusalem came to Jesus, saying, "Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread." He answered and said to them, "Why do you also transgress the commandment of God because of your tradition? For God commanded, saying, 'Honor your father and your mother,' and 'He who curses father or mother, let him be put to death.' But you say, 'Whoever says to his father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me is a gift to God, then he need not honor his father or mother. Thus you have made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition. Hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy about you, saying, 'These people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me, and in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men.' When he had called the multitude to himself, he said to them, 'Hear and understand. Not what goes into the mouth defiles a man, but what comes out of the mouth, this defiles a man.' Then his disciples came and said to him, 'Do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying?' But he answered and said, 'Every plant which my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. Let them alone. They are blind leaders of the blind. And if the blind leads the blind, both will fall into a ditch.' Then Peter answered and said to him, 'Explain this parable to us.' So Jesus said, Are you also still without understanding? Do you not yet understand that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and is eliminated? But those things which proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and they defile a man. For out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemies. These are the things which defile a man. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile a man. Okay, so the miracle of the loaves was not long before the Passover. It's the third Passover, as we said last time. John, in his chapter 7, verse 1, says that after that, Jesus was in Galilee because the Pharisees were looking for him to kill him. Okay? So he did not go to Jerusalem. After the days of the feast were over, and they did not see him in Jerusalem, they were expecting him because he used to come to all the major feasts. They made their way to Galilee to find him there. So Matthew and Mark are in agreement in reporting the conversation of the Lord with the Pharisees, as we heard. Mark makes some explanations for Roman Christians. You know, as you remember, the Gospel of Mark was written in Rome for the Romans, who were not familiar with Jewish customs. For instance, custom about washing hands to the elbows before eating, and about other ablutions, washings. Answering criticism from Pharisees that his disciples break the traditions of the elders, Christ says that these traditions were invented to bypass the law of God. You know, to do away with the law and justify lawlessness. So the Lord quotes Isaiah chapter 29, verse 15, according to the 70, translation of the 70, which of course is all the quotations in the gospel are from the 70. And there's a reason for that. And I probably mentioned that at the beginning of our studies, that the gospels were written in Greek, and this was the text that was available in Greek. Besides, possibly, there wasn't much choice, and that was the most accepted text anyway, even in Hebrew. There's a long history, Masoretic work, production of what we know now as the Hebrew Bible. After answering the critics, Christ addresses the people and his own disciples. And he explains that what defiles a man is not what goes into the mouth, but what comes out of the mouth. As we heard, the various passions and sins. The disciples let him know that the Pharisees were offended by his response. Well, he let them have it, didn't he? Quoting Isaiah like that, wow, it was spot on. Exactly what they were doing. Inside the house, the Lord responds to the comment of the disciples who said about this offense, because, they wanted an explanation. They didn't quite understand what this was about. I mean, they were too much part of that culture. It was a constant effort for them to realign their thinking to the way that Christ wanted them to think. So different to what they had inherited in their upbringing. So why were the Pharisees offended? Well, This comment seemed to them to do away with the Mosaic rules about ablutions. It's like he just brushed it aside. As one level. Secondly, and I think that might have been the even more important reason why they were offended. He, in talking about them, he turned away from that. He was speaking to the crowd about them, like in the third person. He basically ignored them. And by ignoring them, it hit their pride, because they thought of themselves as very respected and authoritative people. And suddenly, a man who was not educated in the rabbinical school is telling them off. How dare he? But Jesus Christ explains to the people, leave them alone. They are blind leaders, leading the blind. They completely deluded. So Peter asks on behalf of the 12 about the mystery of this parable. What does he mean? What goes in doesn't defile, but what goes out defiles a man. And so they receive a clear answer about the inner source of sin and defilement of the spirit. Right. So we just continue reading in Matthew, chapter 15, verses 21 to 28. This is really one of the most moving stories, at least I find the stories. Is, it comes up, when we do the sacrament, the mystery of Holy Unction. It's one of the readings, one of the 7 gospel readings. And it's very moving, and especially in that context. So there it goes. Then Jesus went out from there and departed to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a woman of Canaan came from that region and cried out to him, saying, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely demon-possessed." But he answered her not a word. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she cries out after us." But he answered and said, "I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Then she came and worshipped him, saying, "Lord, help me." But he answered and said, "It is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." And she said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs which fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered and said to her, "O woman, great is your faith. Let it be to you as you desire." And her daughter was healed from that very hour. A very moving exchange. So, this conflict of the Lord with the Pharisees that we just read about before caused him to leave even Galilee, because they were there, and he wanted to get away from them. And they were most likely plotting against him in Galilee. So he moves out to the region of Tyre and Sidon, which were Phoenician cities. Most likely he was on the border of what's now modern Lebanon, which was Phoenicia, which of course at that time was part of the large province called Syria. And Palestine was part of that province, a Roman province. But still, I mean, ethnically, it was a very different place. It was even the pagans spilled over the border. So, you know, the northern parts of Israel, there were many pagan people living there. But most likely also it was the woman who crossed the border, and that Christ did not cross over into the pagan lands because of his answer further down where he says, "I'm not sent except to the people, to the lost sheep of Israel." And remember, recently we read how the Lord instructed his disciples not to even go to the Samaritans at that time, not yet, but just to go to the Israelites. So he himself was doing the same. There was a reason for that. Now, we read from Matthew, but Mark adds a detail. He calls her a Syro-Phoenician, the woman. She was obviously aware of the God of Israel, and he calls Jesus the son of David. Obviously also heard about him. And yes, then when the disciples told him, "Look, she's annoying us, you know, send her away, do something." He says, "I'm not sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." He was working to prepare a base for his new Israel, the church, which would become the ark of salvation for the Gentiles. Just like Saint Simeon says in his wonderful prayer when he takes baby Jesus into his hands. Light of revelation for the Gentiles and the glory of their people, Israel. So the ark of salvation for Gentiles who had the faith, and it was all part of the divine economy. You know, it was a staged process. First, the Lord deals and preaches to Israel and develops a base and prepares it for the descent of the Holy Spirit, birth of the church. Now, when she approaches him directly, the Lord tests her by implying that she, as a pagan, was like an unclean dog, and that she was unworthy of receiving the grace of healing for her daughter. But those harsh words were intended to bring out the best in her. And the Lord knew exactly what to say, to bring the beauty of this soul, this wonderful soul of this woman. Her humility and her faith is just amazing. So now let's turn to Mark and just a little passage in chapter 7, verses 31 to 37. All right. Mark 7, 31 to 37. Okay. Again, departing from the region of Tyre and Sidon, he came through the midst of the region of Decapolis to the Sea of Galilee. Then they brought to him one who was deaf and had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to put his hand on him. And he took him aside from the multitude and put his fingers in his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then, looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephatha, that is, be opened. Immediately his ears were opened, and the impediment of his tongue was loosed, and he spoke plainly. Then he commanded them that they should tell no one, but the more he commanded them, the more widely they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, He has done all things well. He makes both the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. Okay. So from regions of Tyre and Sidon, Jesus goes through Decapolis. Decapolis was on the east bank, okay, east of the Sea of Galilee and Jordan River that flows out of this of the lake. Yes, healing this deaf man with a speech impediment, Jesus implements unusual procedures to heal the man. Probably these procedures that he did communicated something and had special significance for the man. It's quite unusual, touching his ears and spitting and touching his tongue, all of that. Yes, Ephatha is a Syrian word. Syriac ancient means open up. Okay, so this was an area that spoke a different language to very close Semitic. The Jews at that time spoke Aramaic, which they brought from Babylon, which of course is Mesopotamia, which is modern Iraq. That's was close, but nevertheless a different word. So it was a gradual healing, and sometimes we'll see that in some cases Christ heals directly. In other cases, he will gradually introduce some sort of a process beforehand, and that's to prepare the person and to reinforce their faith. Now, Matthew says that Christ actually healed many other people in the Decapolis. Matthew, yes. He talks about the lame, the blind, mute, and maimed. But Matthew does not describe those healings in detail like Mark does in the case of this particular man. So I thought it might be more interesting to read this particular story. So that's it for tonight. All good? All right. Good. Oh, yeah, I almost know the prayer, but I started a new exercise book and I haven't got the text yet. It is meet and right. You'll help me along if I fail. It is meet and right to bless thee, O Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, the mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, beyond compare, more glorious than the seraphim, who without corruption gave us birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, thee do we magnify. Something like that. God bless you all. And we have the last of our Lenten sessions, God willing, next Sunday. And then, because of the festal days, Palm Sunday, Easter, and the first Sunday after Easter, for 3 weeks, we won't have any sessions. I think it's like 2 weeks after Easter that we jumpstart our meetings again. I remember correctly, but maybe even more, because actually, more. We've got this Murderers.
Yeah,
4 weeks. 5. Oh, wow. Well, this is why I
I
wanted
figured it was your break after that. I figured you were on a break after that.
Well, this is the reason, one of the reasons why I thought during Lent, I'll just give you
It might be the
weekly.
5th week.
It might be the
It's
5th
4
week.
weeks then. Fifth week.
Okay. All right. But also, more importantly, Lent is a time when this sort of stuff is absorbed better anyway.